Welcome everyone tuning in today here for the UNESCO World Futures Day. If World Futures Day doesn't resonate with you, don't worry, that makes sense. It had its inaugural day last year. If you're also wondering why we need a full day to honor the future, well, like any other days that are made to mark a significant topic that needs attention or awareness, we and our allies are trying to put public focus on the ever-increasing need for more futures thinking in society, foresight practice in organizations, and also building futures literacy for us as individuals. Today, world leaders are gathering at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris to discuss how we build inclusive societies through futures literacy and foresight. Our contribution here in the studio today at the Institute is the topic of futures thinking in public policy and governance, and we'll touch upon the paradox between short-term election cycles and long-term complex problems. We'll also see how to balance these long-term issues versus immediate needs, and ultimately we'll look at why and how governments worldwide are increasingly working with the future more, and to what end. Now, to unfold some of this above, the Institute is also today launching the Futures Parameter. It is a new initiative from us which unveils data and insights into how the Danes' attitudes towards the future, and some of the highlights from the first edition of that can show that the majority here in Denmark is concerned about the future, and actually 8 out of 10 think political decisions are just quick fixes. There's a clear appetite for more long-term visions in politics, and also the majority think future generations need political representation. So before we get to it, just a brief introduction. My name is Jonas. I'm a director here at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. The Institute, we've been active in the field since 1969, and besides holding a UNESCO chair within Anticipatory Leadership and Futures Capabilities together with Aarhus University, we are also part of several networks and collaboration working towards a common goal of creating representation for the future in policy, governance, and education. In a minute, I'll be joined by some of our international colleagues who are here to inspire us. They've already worked with this field and are here to inspire us that we can maybe implement here in our own country. First of all, I'll be joined by Jeanette, Kwek, who's the head of the Center for Strategic Futures with the Prime Minister's office in Singapore, and also with Jacob Ellis, who's the lead changemaker at the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, as well as a Next Generation Fellow at the UN Foundation and a Youth Foresight Fellow at UNICEF. Welcome, Jeanette and Jacob. We are here. Thank you for joining us here today. We're here to talk about whether there is a lack of practicing foresight in governments, a lack of representation for future generations. You both are part of an initiative addressing this agenda, and hence you serve as pioneers and examples for the rest of us and other nations. So we're very keen on hearing your insights. I want to start out addressing the point on why we need these new ways of working in the public sector and what are the potentials. Jeanette, can we start out with you?
Of course, and thanks very much for inviting me to join you today. To me, it's kind of an odd question because it's not a new way of working for the Singapore government. We've had some form of strategic foresight at the whole of government level since the mid-90s, when we started doing scenario planning and doing national scenarios actually in the mid-90s. But I would say that this capacity is more needed today than ever before, in part because we face truly complex and interrelated challenges in the 21st century that maybe are quite different in texture and complexity that they were in the past. You can find the set of driving forces that the center thinks are most likely to influence our future over the next 20 years on the website. But what I wanted to say is that as a set, we think these trends are telling us that there are stories about possible futures involving the blurring of boundaries that we've become accustomed to, such as the boundaries between the digital and the physical. There are increasing resource constraints that we will face. There are new forms of interconnection and interdependence and new sources of power and influence that arise in the world. that will need us as governments to be organized and to operate differently than we have in the past. And foresight is a great tool in a government's toolkit that allows us to take a fresh approach to understanding the implications and the potential impact of some of these trends on our societies, as well as to imagine new ways to address them.
Very good. Yes. Is there also something about the speed of the complexity that you addressed, that these things are happening, that it's happening faster than it did historically?
Yes, I think that's also very true. The whole idea of the great acceleration, and also that for many of these trends, they accelerate each other as they interact and create new kinds of problems faster than we can imagine new kinds of solutions. And so, in a sense, doing what we've always done to address these challenges doesn't quite seem to be a very fruitful approach.
Very much so. And Jacob, your thoughts on it?
Well, I think we can take the context directly from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said in January 2022 that the only certainty is more uncertainty. He frames this context of a broken system. Business as usual isn't working. The way that we've been doing things for decades, centuries, to some extent, has led us to the same problems, or exacerbating the problems that we've got today, and the vast inequalities that come with that. And we're living in an age of polycrises, this constant battling of current challenges, and they differ across the world, particularly in the global south, but also here in the north too, and constant firefighting of the issues that we have in front of us. So there's no surprise that our politicians, our policymakers, who are generally working in a space of having to meet the current electorate's needs, making sure they get voted in the next time round. So there's a constant kind of framing of here in the present. And I think that enabling us to look up, enabling us to look for those opportunities and solutions that perhaps are a little uncomfortable, are a little outside of the box. The age of experimentation, the age of innovation has to be realized. Otherwise, we will continue constant stream of short-termism and constant firefighting. So I'm hoping that through the course of this podcast, we'll be able to unpick some of those areas that we can start to broaden our horizons to try and think outside the box.
Yes, absolutely. Is there also an essential thing, and it actually leads me on to the next question about potential barriers in adopting this futures thinking. But just to address one of your points, is there also an issue with that every time we do address the future today, we have a certain tendency to look at the now and then sort of write that into the future. So we're planning for the future by how things are today, instead of looking the other way back.
Yeah, and I think that there's a myth that you can only do one of those things, right? You can only think short term, or you can only think long term. One of the quick ways that I try and explain this is that we have a housing crisis in Wales, and we have that across many parts of the world. Now, in a short term kind of mindset, we can decide to just build houses very quickly out of particular material, and then that will be the end of the story. But we can do that in a way that also meets long-term challenges, in the way that where our material is coming from, a transition to greener jobs. Our homes can become warmer, therefore we're tackling a short-term problem of fuel poverty. We've got a cost of living crisis. We can also make these homes warmer, and therefore we're spending less on our energy. So we can make these connections if we only maybe pause and reflect and make those choices purposefully, that forces us to think both in the short term and the long term. I don't think we're in this kind of argument anymore that you can only do one or the other. I think that, it's a culture shift. It's a big culture change, and that's one of the other barriers. This will take time. There are pockets of great examples across the world, and Wales is but one of them, of trying to shift the behaviors in that direction. But that will require a different mindset. Our programs, our people, our skill sets, our policies have, for, as I said earlier, centuries have to kind of move towards the short term. So we're asking people to think differently, and that requires a different kind of energy. But I do think that you can do both the short term and the long term if you only give people the time, the space, the resources, and the permission to think in that way.
Yeah, and regarding permission, is there and Jeanette, maybe I'm also looking at you first here. Is there a lack of incentive? Like we have this, there is an argument for some that we as individuals might not think too much about, the after ourselves, so to speak. Whether politicians are simply thinking, well, I'm not here, so, or they have, that it's so abstract when we talk about planning futures that they don't really feel it's an incentive. You first feel it when your skin burns, so to say. Is there a problem with lacking of clear, tangible incentives for those who are not maybe initiated into the futures thinking sphere?
I think Singapore's experience in this regard might be a little unique. If you look at the circumstances of Singapore's birth as an independent nation, 1965, and the level of uncertainty, I think, that we faced in the very early years of our nationhood, we've also been very, very fortunate to have political leaders and leaders in our public service who have been very aware of the need to both think long term in terms of not just this generation, but what do we lay down for the next generation, but also to be very aware of the need to pay attention to what's happening outside of Singapore's shores. If you look at Singapore's business model, where we operate very much on the flows of people, goods, ideas, money, you name it, through the international system, then it really behooves us to pay attention to when those are changing in case we need to change our model. And so I feel like I operate in a context where I have permission and, in fact, a mandate to encourage the broader public service ecosystem to pay attention to the future. I did want to pick up a little bit on what Jack was saying about foresight and mindsets. I do think that this speaks to one of the most undervalued parts of the foresight practice, which is that it changes how you think and approach problems. I think many people see foresight as a process to produce a product, right? Produce a set of trends, a set of ideas, identify change. But what it really does is it trains us to look at possibilities differently and to not be so fixed in how we see the world, and not to be so linear in how we approach the future. And it's hard to articulate this to decision makers and to members of the public because it's such an intangible value that foresight brings. But I do think it's one of the most powerful things that the practice can add to governance, if we can spread this across public services all over the world.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head there. We're also seeing issues with people learning foresight as a capability, but then afterwards, when they try to implement it, we are seeing indications of them lacking the mindset. So I very much like the approach of saying that foresight thinking is a mindset. Jack, you have something to add here?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that I'm not an academic, and I'm sure there's a PhD in this somewhere. But I think that if we were to look back at the COVID crisis, one that would have affected every country in the world, we would have seen some of the functions, the principles of applying long-term thinking in the way that we dealt with and responded to COVID. And that's kind of a paradox, COVID, which was a short-term, in the moment kind of response. But I think that if you were to question or to identify the functions and the principles and the ways of working that you would encourage civil servants or policymakers to personify in order for them to apply foresight or to apply long-term thinking, you would look at things like collaboration, integration, involvement, prevention, working with different stakeholders and involved citizens. These are some of the early kind of functions that you would seek to explore with civil servants as part of their kind of skills development and skills capabilities around foresight. So I think that, we saw and we see in the bowels of of crises moments. They're moments. Sometimes they're longer than moments, but brief moments where policymakers are using different skill sets, having to work with different people, having to think about solving problems. Now, the skill, of course, is how do you keep and retain those and enhance them into a deeper practice and in a more purposeful, applied context, so that we prevent problems from occurring in the future rather than only responding to them in the moment. But I've been quite struck by how policymakers during the COVID pandemic and other crises in the past who have started to think a bit more creatively about problems, whilst also trying to tackle the short-term needs.
Yeah, I think that's one of the positive outcomes, if we could say, of that pandemic. Jeanette, something you just touched upon, which leads me on to the next thing. So in our domestic survey here in Denmark, we found that the majority of the public agrees on that they don't think that politicians or government think long-term enough. They think it's too short-sighted and too short-term. But it seems also why you're part of this as a big inspiration in Singapore, that's not really the case in Singapore as such. It's more progressive towards future thinking.
As I said earlier, we've been very fortunate at the center, and my many predecessors who have been doing this work in the system, to operate in an environment where our leadership really does see the value of some form of anticipatory capability. And what that form of capability has taken, where it's been cited, who does the work, has changed over time as the public service itself has evolved. But it has always been part of how the system operates since very early in Singapore's history. So I think we don't really have the challenge of a lack of awareness from our decision makers that this capability is valuable. But we face the same challenges any government would have in implementing what comes out of foresight insights, right? That we suffer as much from the urgent pull of the present, the assumptions that we carry from our past as anybody else does. So the only head start we really have is having permission as an organization to try and push against some of these a little bit more robustly in our decision-making processes.
Very, very cool. Jack, on your end, of course, closer to where I'm sitting right now, how's the general vibe there in the public? Do you have any take on it? How does it resonate there?
Again, a little like Jeanette, Wales has possibly taken some more direct steps to address raising awareness and understanding of long-term challenges and how the apparatus needs to respond to that. That being said, this is probably a question that we could spend far too long on to reflect on. The general consensus, however, is that we do live in a cycle, a system that favors an electoral cycle or a financial budgetary cycle, and the traditional general approach in the UK and across the world is one of meeting the short-term needs, and government struggling to convince, justify, take a brave step, be bold, all of those things combined, to provide an alternative vision for a nation. Wales has a very unique piece of legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, that places this legal duty on all our public institutions to think and act for the long term, and has set up a set of national long-term goals. Now, that's quite unique, revolutionary in one respect, to have a set of national long-term goals. And the government will have their officials and departments dedicated to foresight and long-term thinking, publishing a future trends report. But we conducted a bit of a investigation, for want of a better word, a Section 20 review into how the government with applying the Wellbeing Future Generations Act and looking specifically again then on the long-term thinking. And it's a mixed bag. Even when a government in Wales has a law in this space, it still requires culture change. It still requires heavy resourcing. It still needs further advice and support in this space. And the other thing to mention, Jonas, very quickly, I think, is, we have some really strong politicians, leaders in Wales, that I'm sure across the world too, who are brave, right? Who do think about beyond the electoral cycle, this cathedral thinking perspective. And the other point around this is the movements that come alongside this. Politicians won't necessarily change their mindsets unless the movement, the electorate, convince them of such. So it's a two-way approach, and that's why it's really important that we invest the foresight conversations, the long-term conversations within NGOs and communities in cities across the world, and with the private sector and the voluntary sector. That's a valuable space to have a conversation, not only with a politician or with a government official. It's a two-way approach.
It's a push and pull, definitely. But then let's move on to, because the inspiration we're looking at is your specific actions. So maybe for our viewers and listeners, talking about the actions you've done. So Jeanette, let's start with you. The Center for Strategic Futures in Singapore, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way definitely we see it is that you specifically work very much on fusing foresight into the government apparatus broadly. Tell us a bit about how the center was founded. You said you've been active since the 90s, and how it works today. What has been the lessons and changes over the years?
So we like to say that we're an internal think tank for the Singapore government, in that we're a think tank with only one client, which is the Singapore Public Service, Singapore government. The center itself was founded in 2009 to look at the intersection between foresight, complexity, risk, and governance. So how do all of these concepts fit together? But we are really building on a very long history of doing scenario planning within the Singapore government, which began in the 90s, as I said earlier. The whole idea of our journey in strategic foresight in Singapore has really been a series of experiments in how to best derive insights about the future, what processes, what methods, who should do these things, to pull out the best view of what the future might be like, and then connect that with decision making in the policy process. So where should units be sited? What resources should these foresight units have at their disposal in order to try and connect the past with the future, in a sense? And the latest incarnation of how we've been doing this is that the Center for Strategic Futures, the CSF, is now located in a parent organization called the Strategy Group in the Prime Minister's office. And the Strategy Group's mandate is to do whole of government policy coordination and strategic planning, to ensure that the whole public service has a view of what our ambitions are as a country, what do we want to get done, and how we're going to get there. And the center was put in the Strategy Group to provide that much longer term frame for our medium-term decision-making, which then in turn drives how we deal with today's problems. What Jack was saying earlier about you have to deal with the problem that's on fire today, but you can deal with it in a way that sets you up positively for the medium term, and then hopefully even more so for the longer term. So that's our job within the construct of the Strategy Group, is to try and tell everyone that the decisions that we take today, they have an impact on the medium term, but they also have an impact on the long term. And I would say that this structural setup has been thus far quite successful in giving the output of the CSF somewhere to go. We have ready-made partners within Strategy Group who can help us translate what the long-term future means in terms of medium-term priorities. And then from medium-term, working directly with agencies to decide, well, how does it change actions I take today in order to achieve those medium-term objectives? And that ability to translate, I think, is one that's been quite crucial to giving foresight a real foothold in the policy-making process. How different countries or different international systems choose to operationalize that chain from insight to strategy really depends on your organizational context. But this, I think, is something that we found works for us, at least for now.
Yeah. Well, very good. That's something, well, you already mentioned some concrete examples on how that framework has helped and what's the actual output of that. Is there, going forward, what are the apropos thinking long term? What is there a long-term goal or aspiration for the center, seeing this unfold more throughout the government in Singapore, besides working as an example for the rest of us?
It's a great question, and it's one that we ask ourselves. We've been asking ourselves quite a lot, actually. The center will turn 15 next year, so we're all in a bit of a self-reflective mood. But it's also because it's been an explicit part of the center's mandate to build capability across the public service. My team spends a third, sometimes more than a third of its time helping individual ministries and agencies build their own in-house foresight teams.
Well,
And that changes the foresight ecosystem within the Singapore government. Teams can focus on issues most closely related to their domain, which frees the center up to look at things that are truly nascent or truly cross-cutting that don't have a current policy owner. It does change what we do and what our focus is. So over time, we may not do what we do now because somebody else is capable of doing it, which behooves the center to then ask, what comes next? What should we do now?
yeah. Well, very interesting. That's why we're in this. But very glad to hear about the example of this actually feeding into other domains of the government, and that I think that's a natural progression for how this should be done. So, Jack, on to you. You are very broadly engaged globally, but I want to just focus on your work in Wales within the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner. We see this is again with external eyes, but we see you very much as a voice for the future and specifically to create representation for future generations. So it's sort of a more, it's more representative of a group that doesn't exist yet in terms of a specific capability. So how did that come about and how is it organized today? Maybe you can put a few words on it.
Yeah. Well, in essence, it's a great story of a People's Act. A national conversation in 2014 led the way for us to establish the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act as we see it today. It later passed in 2015. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, setting this national vision for 2050 and then beyond of the 7 interconnected national long-term goals, and this legal expectation on all our public institutions, whether or not you're in government, in local government, if you're in health, if you are in some of our national bodies that cover sport or the museum or natural resources, this collective movement with our responsibility of making decisions not only for today, but for those not yet born. It also establishes then the role of the Future Generations Commissioner, my boss, Derek Walker, and an independent commissioner. I mean, that's important to stress. You know, this position doesn't sit within the government, but holds the government and the other entities to account in this space. And this builds on the foundations in Wales of being a truly intergenerational space. We have a children's commissioner, an older people's commissioner, again, the first country in the world to establish an older people's commissioner. We also have a Welsh language commissioner, but the Future Generations Commissioner is there to advise and support those institutions to monitor the progress made against the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act. We're a small but dedicated team of 28 or so, and we've truly been blown away by the momentum, the appetite, the energy that the public institutions have put to this agenda, but recognizing, of course, that this is a big project. We are over 7 years now into the into the legislation. We soon hope to celebrate the 50th anniversary that Singapore will celebrate next year. Happy early birthday, Jeanette. But this space is exciting. Okay, Wales is still the only country to have legislated the Sustainable Development Goals in this Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's the only country to have an independent Future Generations Commissioner. But I hope it speaks volumes that it is possible. It is possible to think and act for the long term. It is possible to legislate in that space. But Jeanette is right. The different contexts around the world will mean a different approach, adaptable approach to this. And one size doesn't fit all. And we stand on the shoulders in Wales of the many countries and indigenous communities across the world who have been practicing foresight, who have been practicing this idea of representing the needs and interests of future generations. So Wales doesn't claim to own this space. In fact, that we only learn and continue to adapt in our approaches. And some of the impact maybe of the work that we've done so far. We've managed to reform our national curriculum that puts an emphasis on climate justice, on racial justice, and on creating global citizens. We have had a period of moratorium on road building. There was a period in Wales where we didn't build roads because we knew that it wasn't in the best interests of future generations to continue to build in this way. We have an ambition to have a national forest. We've got, these are national policies, but we've got public bodies, health boards, planting trees and contributing towards that agenda. We're also having solar farms on hospital sites. So real different mindsets, different perspectives on how to approach things. And then, this is hopefully going to inspire the new generation of policymakers coming through, seeing that these things can be possible under having a piece of legislation that gives them the impetus to do it in this way.
Yeah, it's amazing the diversity of focuses where you are able to implement this mindset, which is a great. You are a very good case study, and at least here in Europe for us, you're sort of the predominant case that we point to in the argument. And just lastly on that, Jake, on your end, what are the aspirations? Where are you going next in Wales on this?
Well, I mentioned Derek Walker earlier. He is the newly appointed, I think I can still say newly appointed Future Generations Commissioner since the 1st of March this year, and has recently published his new strategy, Cymru Can. We recognise that we are 8 years into the legislation now, and that will require a different kind of energy, a different kind of focus, a deepening of the implementation and impact with our public bodies, our public institutions. And this focus, 4 thematic focuses, one on climate and nature, one on the culture and Welsh language, this kind of uniqueness of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is that we place culture alongside social, environmental and economic well-being. Then the 3rd mission around the well-being economy, and then finally one on health and social care. So we're in a different space, and it's important to recognise that it's taken 7 years, 8 years to raise awareness of the Act, and now we're starting to see some of those great ambitions taking root. And now we're moving into that shift, I think, of deepening the implementation and working in collaboration with the various sectors out there who voluntarily take on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, not our policymakers, but those who sit in our civic society, in our communities, in the private sector, who see this as something that will only better their strategies and their approaches too. So exciting period ahead of us in Wales. And one of the very small projects that we do, because it's very, very relevant to foresight and long-term thinking, is that we established a few years ago the Future Generations Leadership Academy, a cohort well into the 80s now of young leaders across Wales who get a deepened understanding of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but then get a kind of the opportunities to reverse mentor current leaders who are starting now to trickle their way through different leadership roles across a variety of sectors in Wales. So whilst we have a complete understanding of kind of where our current leaders are at in Wales and a big shift and a big mindset drive that's needed there, and energy that we also kind of invest in new leadership of the future too.
Absolutely, and I also think you just touched upon the point of cross-sector interaction and cross-community. Like, this is not just a debate within governance. It's also in business or in academia, in the civic sector, and in the general public. So absolutely. If we just here lastly zoom out on a global scale, we're seeing, of course, you represent nations that have done something and for quite some time, but we're also seeing it on an international scale, and of course with the UN Common Agenda and now the UN 2.0 plan, which also identifies foresight as a pivotal element. And of course, they're advocating that member states follow suit and implement this as well. And we're also going to have the Summit of the Future next year in September, which hopefully will secure a pact for the future. In your opinion, what do you see as some of the effects this could have? Jeanette, let's start out with you.
I actually think this is a wonderful thing for the international system, both because it demonstrates the value that international institutions like the United Nations can bring to member states to help develop new capabilities, new capacities, and to share knowledge and learning across different systems to help us deal with challenges that we will all face as a globe. We can't get away. We can't pretend that these disruptions and these trends are not going to affect our little corner of the globe. So I think to see the UN put effort into using foresight as a way to build capacity in member nations, but also build capacity in itself to deal with some of these changes is, to me, really inspiring to watch. And hopefully for us to get involved in some small way to support these efforts, whatever we can do.
Yeah. And Jack?
Well, I think it's an important signal and a symbol that the UN system is readying itself to not only be ready to prepare and support member states, but it's looking internally. It's saying if the many decades that the UN has been in establishment now needs a rethink, a review, a reform, then it must do so in a way that is ready to tackle some of the challenges the member states are also challenged to think about. So I was fortunate to work on a set of UN common principles for future generations, advising the high-level committees on program on that development. And it's a set of 8 principles. And okay, we must translate words into action, but it's a rallying call, an internal rallying call to say, the 400,000 or more the workforce across the UN have now signed up to this set of principles around foresight and future generations. It's sending that signal to member states saying, we're ready to support you. We're going to get this right internally. We're going to put the systems in place. The UN 2.0 plan is about recognizing that we must think more creatively. We must put the mechanisms in place. But what a catalyst that will become, that if the UN gets those things right, and it probably won't all the time, but if it starts to put in place some of those key levers, then my hope and my aspirations for how that will affect the broader multilateral system and how that trickles down to country level can only be a really positive thing. So my full support and energy to the UN at this very complex, difficult time for them, having to navigate a series of difficult challenges, to not lose sight of that long-term plan of reform in this space, because get it right and it'll mean a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to cheer you up on that point, I know that the Common Principles for Future Generations is meant for the UN system, but I can tell you that the Institute, we've also adopted them and are committed to them, especially number 4, 6, and 7. And we are also trying to affect everyone we work with outside of it. So that means in business or civic sector academia to also attribute to them. So thank you very much for those. I guess that also comes into you've already touched upon some of your hopes and aspirations for this and what it means. But specifically next year we'll have the summit where we'll all meet. There will be a pact there. Any sort of hopes on what could be the outcome? Some are talking about that, well, maybe we'll do some new Sustainable Development Goals because they're running out in 2030? Is the pact going to take over from that? Any thoughts on your hopes for the outcome of that summit?
I have a series of conflictions in my mind, right? The only way that this is going to be a successful summit of the future with a negotiated pact for the future, with a, fingers crossed, a successful declaration for future generations as part of that, is if we do a few quick things. And I say quick because we need to do this quickly, is we need to have a common understanding about what we mean by future generations. We're not talking about young people. We're talking about those not yet born. And there are already a lot of people and a lot of committees, because that's how we do things, who have published a series of good definitions. And my sympathy to the member states co-facilitating the Summit of the Future and the Declaration for Future Generations on this constant Groundhog Day approach that we've had around trying to navigate the language around the future generations. And I appreciate it's difficult, particularly for those countries who have real short-term kind of in-the-moment challenges that they have to face, and that this is a new concept. I say new concept, but actually some of the terminologies have been used by the UN for decades. So I think terminology is important. And I think we must get that right soon in order for us to move forward into the more detail and the actions around the summit. My second kind of contradiction or area of challenge is that this has to be seen more than just a moment. The Summit of the Future, and indeed any of the moments that the UN put together, can often feel like one moment in time and then we move on. So we have to see this as that kind of the building blocks, the start of the conversation, the catalyst for those changes. And my deeper hope, my hope above all, is that of course we have a successfully negotiated pact for the future, but also this idea of a UN special envoy for future generations. And our hopes is that position would be filled before the summit of the future. But if that's not possible, for that role to come quite soon, replicating some of the work that we've done in Wales with our own independent Future Generations Commissioner. But I'm filled with optimism for the year ahead. I think that having any focus on long-term and futures is a good thing, let alone now at the very highest level for that to happen. So again, fingers crossed, and my well wishes to the co-facilitators and to the member states in this period.
Yes. And Jeanette, your hopes?
Well, I could not put it any better than Jack just had. So I agree with everything he said. I think the point about it being a moment in time, for me, the struggle is to remember that the future is made up of a long string of moments in time. So every bit of progress that we can make, no matter how small it seems, is part of how that path is going to unfold. I think I struggle very much with this notion of strategic patience, right? We can't get everything done all at once. But if we give up on making any progress because we can't make all progress at once, then it's a very self-defeating kind of approach. So again, I think my best wishes, I hope that we get something that members can come away from the Summit of the Future with something that they feel they can do, whatever small steps they can take that put us on that more positive path for the future. And fingers crossed. And all the best. We're rooting for you.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure. And just finally wrapping up, any sort of advice for both us Danes or maybe other nations and countries that actually want to take initiatives such as Wales and Singapore has done? Anything advice for us? Where do we start? Should go grassroots? How do we mobilize? Any pointers for us?
Where do we start? There are so many learning there, but that's a good thing, right? Is that we have a period of looking at 7 years of learning here in the Welsh context. Anyway, we published a series of resources that are targeted towards how you continually improve the practice of applying future generations, and we do that with Welsh audience in mind, but it's relevant to other countries seeking to adopt similar approaches. So that's called a maturity matrix, and no doubt we can support listeners to find these resources on our website afterwards. We also published and produced a youth accelerator. So this is important because it's about how do you mobilize young people in this space, and that's a free online course about the introduction to the concept of future generations, and that's been used now by over 700 young people, majority from the global south too, which is really exciting. So that's a useful resource. And then thirdly, we produced a policy toolkit for future generations, targeting parliamentarians and politicians and government officials. Again, that's it's in podcast form, a little bit like you're listening today, but in the hope that you can look at a variety of choices. You can set up a committee for future generations. You could just commit to publishing a future trends report or a future generations report. You could go the whole way as the Welsh model and produce an independent commissioner with a legal footprint, or it would be super exciting to create something totally new too. And we might be looking here at creating something that hasn't yet been done. But look for those allies, look for the movement building that can take place across multiple thematic policy areas. The danger with any of these conversations that you silo them to a particular department in a particular room in the particular ministry. But the fact that the Future Generations Act is relevant to all government ministers, it doesn't sit solely with one of them, means that you're energizing and elevating the discussion. But you have allies across the world, not only in Denmark on this agenda, and again in the same hopes and aspirations for the UN Summit of the Future. I hope that by then maybe the start of the conversation will have developed a little bit further, and that Denmark can be the next to have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act or an independent Future Generations Commission.
We hope so too. Jeanette, anything to add on your?
Two things, I guess. One, otherwise I'll be here all day because this is one of my favorite topics. But my first thing is, don't listen to me. Listen to the fellow foresight units across the Singapore Public Service. In our most recent Conversations for the Future volume 3, we asked our newest teams across the system to reflect on their experiences setting up a new foresight unit inside their organizations. And they very kindly wrote down advice for other teams, reflections on how it's gone for them. And we published it in our journal right alongside our reflections on how it's been to operate in the center at the strategy group over the last few years. So if there's some practical advice there and some philosophical reflections. The second thing I'm going to say is I'm going to quote a former boss whom I'm sure many of you know, who told me once, Jeanette, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. You'll never be able to develop a perfect foresight system for your context. Sometimes good enough is good enough. We just start doing, and we make those baby steps, and you bend the progress towards the future in the direction you want to go. But if we sit around and try and design for the most Pareto optimal outcomes that we can imagine, we'll never get going. We'll be too afraid of getting it wrong. So just try and make progress that way would be my advice, along with everything that, Jacob just said.
Well, very wise words. Jeanette, I want to thank you very much for joining me here today, and also for your pioneering work and being an inspiration. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I want to thank you for watching this future seminar on the Futures Thinking in Public Policy and Governance. Remember that we here at the Institute, we are an independent nonprofit think tank. Our purpose is to help people and organizations imagine, work with, and shape their future. Our vision here is a futures literate world where everyone has the right and mandate to engage with the future, participate, and visualize change, so they can make the best possible futures for themselves, society, and the planet. My name is Jonas G. Mikkelsen. I'm a director here at the Institute. Please reach out to me if you want to engage with us and join us in working towards more futures thinking in the public policy making. And you can also read more about the Institute on our website. Thank you for joining me here today.